They laughed while the alien girl starved. Then one human said, "Come eat with me." Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. The Galactic Academy of Xenosciences was not just the most prestigious educational institution in the Andromeda Alliance. It was also the most ruthless. Its gleaming silver towers stood tall against the purple-hued sky of Nexus Prime, a beacon of knowledge that attracted the brightest minds from 1,000 worlds. Among its newest students was Lyra, the first Solarian ever admitted to the Academy. Lyra sat alone at the far end of the crowded cafeteria, her slender blue fingers trembling as she examined the tray of food before her. 3 weeks had passed since her arrival, and she had lost nearly 15% of her body mass. The nutrient paste served to the student body was formulated for the dominant species of the Alliance, mainly the Viridians, Tellurians, and Nexians, but contained compounds that were mildly toxic to her Solarian physiology. She pushed the food around with her utensil, her luminescent eyes dimming with each passing moment. The Academy administration had dismissed her dietary concerns as adaptational challenges that she would need to overcome if she wished to prove herself worthy of her scholarship. After all, exceptions were not made for anyone, especially not for a species as new to interstellar politics as the Solarians. At the center of the cafeteria, a group of Viridian students watched her with amusement. Their silver-scaled skin reflected the ambient light as they whispered among themselves, occasionally breaking into what passed for laughter in their culture, a series of clicking sounds that echoed throughout the hall. "Look at the Solarian trying to eat again," said Drex, the self-appointed leader of the group. "I give her another week before she drops out or starves." "The administration should never have accepted her kind," added Vela, her dorsal ridges flaring with contempt. "Solarians are barely spacefaring. What could they possibly contribute to the Alliance?" Their mockery was interrupted when Mason Reed, the only human student at the Academy, walked into the cafeteria. Humans were even newer to the galactic stage than Solarians, having achieved faster-than-light travel just 15 Earth years ago. Mason was something of an anomaly, accepted to the Academy not through the normal channels, but as part of a diplomatic initiative between Earth and the Andromeda Alliance. Mason had noticed the blue-skinned girl sitting alone every day since orientation, getting visibly thinner as the weeks progressed. He'd heard the rumors about her physiological incompatibility with the standard meal plan, but had been too preoccupied with his own struggles to approach her. Today, however, something changed. As he passed by the Viridian table, he overheard their cruel remarks and saw the genuine distress on the Solarian girl's face. Without a second thought, he changed course and headed straight for her table. "Mind if I join you?" Mason asked, setting his tray down across from her. Lyra looked up, surprised by the unexpected company. "You are the human, yes?" "Mason Reed of Earth." "That's me," he confirmed with a smile. "And you're Lyra from Solaris Prime, right? First of your kind at the Academy." She nodded, her luminescent eyes studying him cautiously. "Why have you chosen to sit here?" "The others avoid me." "The others are idiots," Mason replied simply. He glanced at her untouched tray. "You haven't been eating." It wasn't a question, but Lyra answered anyway. "I cannot. The standard nutrition formula contains trace amounts of zirconium compounds. In Solarians, these compounds bind to our nutrient receptors and prevent proper absorption. It is not immediately toxic, but you're slowly starving," Mason finished for her. "Have you reported this to the administration?" "3 times, Lyra said, her voice barely audible. "They claim it is an adaptational challenge that I must overcome." Mason's jaw tightened. He reached into his bag and pulled out a sealed container. "I thought that might be the case. Here, try this. It's from my personal stash from Earth. No zirconium compounds, I promise." Lyra hesitated, her gaze shifting between Mason and the container. "Why would you share your food with me? We are not clanmates or study partners." "Because where I come from, we don't let people starve when we can help it," Mason said simply. "Besides, I've been reading about Solarian physiology. Your people can process most Earth foods without issue. Our planets developed surprisingly similar biochemical building blocks despite being galaxies apart. Lyra carefully opened the container to find an assortment of dried fruits, nuts, and what appeared to be some kind of protein bar. She cautiously picked up a dried apricot and placed it in her mouth. The effect was immediate. Her luminescent eyes brightened, and the markings along her temples began to glow a soft purple. "This is compatible," she said with evident relief. "How did you know?" "I didn't for sure," Mason admitted. "But I've been studying xenobiology in my spare time. It's actually why I applied to the academy in the first place." Across the cafeteria, the Viridian students had noticed the interaction and were watching with increasing displeasure. Drex, in particular, seemed agitated by the humans' intervention. "It seems the primitive species are forming an alliance," he remarked loudly enough for his voice to carry. How fitting that the two newest, least evolved member races would find comfort in each other's inadequacies. Mason heard the comment but chose to ignore it, focusing instead on Lyra. "Don't mind them. They're just insecure because they've never had to adapt to anything in their privileged lives." Lyra continued eating, her strength visibly returning with each bite. "This generosity will be remembered," Mason read of Earth. In Solarian culture, the sharing of sustenance creates a bond of trust that. She was interrupted as Drex and two other Viridians approached their table, their silver scales shifting hues to indicate aggression. "Human," Drex addressed Mason directly, ignoring Lyra completely. "Your behavior is disruptive to the natural order of the Academy. Each species must prove their worth without external assistance. By aiding the Solarian, you undermine the foundational principles of this institution." Mason took a slow, deliberate bite of his sandwich before responding. "Interesting. I must have missed the section in the Academy Charter that mandates starvation as a prerequisite for education." The Viridian's scales flushed a deep crimson. "Your primitive sarcasm does not change the reality of your situation. Both of you are here on conditional acceptance. The Alliance is still evaluating whether your species deserve full membership. Actions like this only prove that you are not ready." "Actions like what?" Mason challenged, standing up to face Drex. Despite being shorter than the Viridian, he showed no sign of intimidation. "Sharing food with someone who's hungry? Where I come from, that's called basic decency. Where you come from is a backwater planet that only recently discovered how to break its own atmospheric boundary," Drex sneered. "You humans think you're special because you developed faster than most, but you're centuries behind the rest of us." Mason smiled, which seemed to confuse the Viridian. "You're right about one thing, Drex. We are behind in many ways. But while you were perfecting your faster-than-light drives, we were perfecting something else." "And what might that be?" Drex asked condescendingly. "Adaptation," Mason replied. "Humans thrive on challenge. We evolved on a death world with predators that could tear us apart, weather that could freeze or boil us alive, and diseases that nearly wiped us out multiple times. We didn't have the luxury of a stable environment like Viridia. We had to adapt or die." The cafeteria had gone quiet, with students of various species now watching the confrontation with interest. "And Solarians," Mason continued, gesturing toward Lyra, "evolved in an environment with frequent solar radiation storms that would kill most species in this room. They developed cellular regeneration capabilities that our scientists are still trying to comprehend. So before you talk about who deserves to be here, maybe consider that different evolutionary paths produce different kinds of intelligence and resilience." Drex's companions shifted uncomfortably, but the Viridian leader stood his ground. "Impressive speech, human. But words don't change facts. The Solarian is failing to adapt to our standard nutrition. That weakness alone proves. It proves nothing except your inability to understand basic biology," interrupted a new voice. All heads turned to see Professor Narration, the Academy's head of xenobiology, approaching their table. The Tellurian professor's four eyes blinked in sequence as she surveyed the scene. "Professor Kale," Drex straightened immediately, his scales shifting to a more neutral tone. We were merely explaining academy traditions to the new students. Were you? Professor Kale's tone made it clear she wasn't convinced. Because it sounded to me like you were demonstrating a remarkable ignorance of cross-species biochemistry, which is concerning for a third-year xenobiology student. She turned to Lyra, her expression softening. Student Lyra, I was recently made aware of your nutritional difficulties. I must apologize for the oversight. The standard meal plan is indeed incompatible with Solarian physiology, and it was an administrative failure not to address this. Lyra's eyes widened in surprise. Thank you, Professor, but how did you become aware of my situation? Professor Kale glanced at Mason. Student Reed submitted a rather comprehensive analysis of Solarian Earth biochemical compatibilities to my department yesterday, along with a formal petition for meal plan accommodation citing Section 14.3 of the Alliance Equal Educational Opportunity Act. Mason shrugged when Lyra looked at him questioningly. I told you I've been studying xenobiology in my spare time. Professor Kale continued. Effective immediately, the cafeteria will offer nutrition options compatible with Solarian physiology. And as for you, Student Drex, she fixed her 4 eyes on the Viridian. I expect a 5,000-word dissertation on my desk by weeks in discussing the ethical implications of biochemical discrimination in educational settings. Drex's scales paled to an ashen gray. Yes, Professor. As Professor Kale departed and the Viridians retreated, Lyra turned to Mason with newfound respect in her luminescent eyes. You did this for me? Why? We were strangers. Mason smiled as he continued eating his lunch. Because that's what humans do. We see problems, and we try to fix them. Besides, I figured if I'm going to spend the next 4 years at the academy, I might as well make at least one friend. Lyra's facial markings glowed a warm golden hue, the Solarian equivalent of a blush. I believe I would like to be your friend, Mason Reed of Earth. From that day forward, Mason and Lyra became inseparable. What began as a simple act of kindness evolved into a deep friendship that would eventually reshape the Academy's approach to interspecies relations. Mason continued sharing his Earth food with Lyra until the cafeteria implemented the promised dietary accommodations, and in return, she helped him navigate the complex social hierarchies of the Academy. Their friendship did not go unnoticed. Some students, inspired by Mason's actions, began to question the rigid traditions that had long defined the Academy. Others, particularly among the more conservative species like the Viridians, viewed their growing influence with concern. 3 months after their first lunch together, Mason and Lyra were preparing for the Academy's most challenging trial, the Xenoscience Practical Examination. This grueling test required students to demonstrate their knowledge of alien biology, technology, and cultural practices in a series of high-pressure scenarios. I'm still not sure about the Nexian respiratory system, Mason admitted as they studied in the Academy's vast library. Their tracheal structure seems contradictory to their evolved environment. Lyra's fingers danced over her data tablet, bringing up a 3-dimensional model of Nexian anatomy. That is because you are thinking in terms of continuous evolution. The Nexians underwent a period of self-directed genetic modification approximately 3,000 years ago. Their current respiratory system is partially engineered. Mason whistled low. That would have been good to know earlier. No wonder I couldn't make sense of it naturally. The information was in the supplementary texts, Lyra pointed out, her tone gently teasing. Perhaps if you spent less time petitioning the administration on behalf of other students, you would have had time to read them. She was referring to Mason's growing reputation as an advocate for overlooked species issues at the Academy. Following his successful petition for Solarian dietary accommodations, students from other minority species had begun approaching him with their own concerns. Environmental adjustments for the ammonia-breathing Denvarians, modified testing procedures for the time-dilated perception of the Cronians, and more. Someone has to do it, Mason replied with a shrug. And apparently, no one thought to before. That is not entirely accurate, came a voice from behind them. They turned to find Vela, the female Viridian who had been part of Drex's group, standing awkwardly by their table. "May we help you, Vela of Viridia?" Lyra asked formally, her posture tensing slightly. "Aye." Vela seemed uncharacteristically hesitant. "I wish to inform you that some of us have attempted to address these issues in the past. The administration is resistant to change." Mason and Lyra exchanged surprised glances. "You've tried to help other species at the Academy?" Mason asked, making no attempt to hide his skepticism. "Not publicly," Vela admitted, her scales shifting to a muted blue, a sign of shame in Viridian body language. "Our social structure rewards conformity and punishes deviation. But yes, some of us have recognized the inequities within the system." She placed a data crystal on their table. "This contains research from the last 50 years on biochemical compatibilities across Alliance species. It includes some information that is not available in the General Academy database. It may be useful for your examination preparation." Before either of them could respond, Vela continued. "Drex and his followers represent a traditional faction among our people, but they do not speak for all Viridians. Some of us recognize that the future of the Alliance depends on genuine cooperation, not mere assimilation." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Mason and Lyra to contemplate this unexpected development. "Well," Mason said after a moment, "I guess we shouldn't judge an entire species by their loudest members." Lyra picked up the data crystal, examining it with curiosity. "Indeed, perhaps there is more potential for change within the Academy than we realized." They spent the next several hours reviewing the information Vela had provided, discovering valuable insights into the biological intricacies of various Alliance species. The crystal contained not just scientific data, but also personal accounts from students who had struggled with the Academy's one-size-fits-all approach to education. As the library's ambient lighting dimmed to signal the approaching curfew, Lyra looked up from her studies with a thoughtful expression. "Mason, I have been considering something. The Xenoscience practical examination is designed to be completed by individuals, but there is nothing in the regulations that explicitly prohibits collaboration." Mason raised an eyebrow. "What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting that perhaps the examination itself is flawed. In real xenoscientific fieldwork, diverse teams are essential precisely because different species perceive and process information differently. A Solarian can detect radiation levels that would be invisible to a human, while a human might notice environmental patterns that a Solarian would miss. So instead of competing against each other," Mason began, "we demonstrate the superior outcomes of interspecies cooperation," Lyra finished. "It would be a practical demonstration of the very principles the Academy claims to uphold." Mason grinned. "That's brilliant, Lyra. But we'd need more than just the two of us to make a convincing case." "Perhaps," Lyra said, her gaze drifting toward the direction Vela had departed. "We already have potential allies we had not considered." The day of the Xenoscience practical examination arrived with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety permeating the Academy. Students gathered in the Great Examination Hall, a vast circular chamber with transparent walls that revealed the purple skies of Nexus Prime. Examination pods were arranged in concentric circles, each designed to isolate students as they faced their individual challenges. Mason and Lyra entered together, immediately noting the presence of not just Academy students, but also a gallery of observers, representatives from various Alliance worlds who had come to witness the performance of this year's cohort. The stakes were higher than they had realized. Professor Kale stood at the center of the hall, her four eyes surveying the assembled students with practiced neutrality. "Welcome to the Xenoscience practical examination. Today, you will demonstrate not just your knowledge, but your ability to apply that knowledge in scenarios that simulate real galactic fieldwork. Each of you has been assigned an examination pod based on your species' specific needs and your academic focus." She paused, her gaze lingering briefly on Mason and Lyra. "The examination will begin in precisely 10 minutes. Use this time to prepare yourselves." As students moved toward their assigned pods, Mason and Lyra enacted the first phase of their plan. Instead of separating, they approached Professor Kale directly. "Professor," Mason began, "we wish to request a modification to our examination parameters." Professor Kale's outer eyes blinked with surprise while her inner eyes narrowed with interest. "Explain." "We propose to take the examination as a collaborative unit," Lyra stated clearly. "We believe this approach more accurately reflects the reality of xenoscientific work in the field." Before Professor Kale could respond, another voice joined the conversation. "We wish to join this collaborative unit," said Vela, who had approached with two other students, a crystalline Denvar named Crix and a time-sensitive Cronian named Tila. Professor Kale's four eyes widened slightly, the Tellurian equivalent of astonishment. She glanced at the gallery of Alliance observers, many of whom were now watching the unexpected development with interest. "This is highly irregular," she said, lowering her voice. "The examination is designed to test individual capability." "With respect, Professor," Mason countered, "the real galaxy doesn't work that way. When we face unknown challenges in the field, we rely on diverse teams precisely because different species bring different strengths." Crix, the crystalline Denvarian, stepped forward. The ambient light refracted through their translucent body as they spoke in their characteristic harmonic tones. "The human speaks truth, Professor. My species can detect energy frequencies that none here can perceive, but I cannot process visual information in the same spectrum as most humanoids. Complementary abilities are the foundation of effective xenoscience." Professor Kale seemed to be considering their argument when a commotion erupted from across the hall. Drex and several other traditional Viridians were approaching rapidly, their scales shifting to aggressive patterns. "This is an outrage," Drex declared loudly, ensuring the observers could hear. "They seek to undermine the entire examination process. Individual merit has been the cornerstone of academy evaluation for 7 centuries. The hall fell silent as students and observers alike watched the confrontation unfold. Mason noticed one observer in particular, an elderly Nexian with elaborate ceremonial markings indicating a high governmental position, leaning forward with evident interest. Professor Kale raised all 4 of her hands, calling for order. "This is neither the time nor place for such a debate." "On the contrary," came a resonant voice from the gallery. The elderly Nexian had risen to his feet. "I believe this is precisely the time and place." The students fell into respectful silence as High Chancellor Morn of the Andromeda Alliance approached. His elongated form moved with fluid grace despite his advanced age, and the ceremonial sash across his chest glittered with the insignia of 100 worlds. "High Chancellor," Professor Kale said with a formal bow, "we are honored by your presence, but this is a minor academic dispute that perfectly encapsulates the very issues the Council has been debating for the past decade." The Chancellor interrupted smoothly. "The question of how we integrate new species into the Alliance is not merely administrative, but foundational to our future." He turned his attention to the small group of students. "You propose a collaborative approach to the examination?" Mason stepped forward, meeting the Chancellor's gaze directly. "Yes, sir. We believe that diversity is not just an inconvenience to be managed, but a strength to be leveraged. Different species perceive the universe differently, and when we combine those perspectives, we achieve greater understanding than any single species could alone." The Chancellor's facial ridges rippled, a sign of thoughtful consideration in Nexian physiology. A bold assertion. "And you, young Viridian," he addressed Drex, "you favor the traditional approach of individual assessment." Drex straightened his posture, his scales settling into a formal pattern. "The Academy has produced the Alliance's finest minds for centuries using these methods. Changing them to accommodate the limitations of newer species would only lower our standards and weaken our scientific community." "I see," the Chancellor said, his voice neutral. He was silent for a long moment, during which the entire examination hall seemed to hold its breath. Finally, He turned to Professor Kale. I propose an experiment. High Chancellor, Professor Kale asked, clearly uncertain. Allow both approaches to proceed, he explained. The traditional individual examination for those who wish it, and this proposed collaborative method for those who volunteer. The results should prove instructive. Professor Kale hesitated, then nodded. As you wish, High Chancellor. We will need to modify the examination parameters accordingly. You have 30 minutes, the Chancellor declared, returning to his seat in the gallery. What followed was a flurry of activity as Professor Kale and her staff reconfigured the examination protocols. Students throughout the hall engaged in heated discussions, with some approaching Mason and Lyra's growing group with interest, while others clustered around Drex, reinforcing their commitment to the traditional methods. In the end, 15 students, representing 11 different species, joined the collaborative team, while the rest, approximately 200 students, proceeded with the individual examination. This is unprecedented, Lyra whispered to Mason as they were led to a larger examination chamber designed to accommodate their entire group. The Academy has never permitted such a deviation from established protocol. Sometimes all it takes is one person saying this could be different to change centuries of tradition, Mason replied with a grin. Besides, I think the Chancellor has been waiting for something like this. Did you see how quickly he intervened? Vela, who was walking behind them, leaned forward. The Alliance Council has been deadlocked on integration policies for years. The traditionalists insist on assimilation, newcomer species adapting entirely to established Alliance norms. The progressives argue for accommodation, evolving our systems to incorporate diverse needs and perspectives. And the Academy is a microcosm of that larger debate, Mason realized aloud. Precisely, Vela confirmed. This examination may have implications far beyond our academic careers. The modified examination proved to be even more challenging than the standard version. Instead of isolated scenarios, the collaborative team faced a complex, interconnected simulation of a newly discovered planetary system with multiple biospheres, each presenting unique scientific and ethical challenges. The team quickly organized itself according to abilities rather than species. Crix and another crystalline Denvarian focused on energy analysis, their bodies literally glowing with different colors as they processed radiation data. The Cronians, with their accelerated temporal perception, handled rapid sequence events that would have been a blur to other species. Lyra and two other Solarians mapped biochemical interactions, their natural sensitivity to molecular structures proving invaluable. Mason found himself in a coordination role, his human adaptability allowing him to synthesize information across different perceptual frameworks. It was chaotic at first, with 15 different communication styles colliding, but they quickly developed a shared vocabulary and methodology. Meanwhile, the individual examinees worked in isolation, each facing a scaled-down version of the same simulation tailored to their species' capabilities. Hours passed as both groups progressed through the examination. In the gallery, Alliance observers watched with growing interest, many taking extensive notes. The High Chancellor remained motionless, his ancient eyes fixed on the collaborative team with an unreadable expression. Final sequence initiating, announced the examination system's neutral voice. Planetary destabilization detected. Determine optimal response within allocated time frame. The collaborative team's view screens filled with alarming data. The simulated planet was experiencing catastrophic tectonic shifts due to interaction with a rogue gravitational anomaly. Millions of simulated life forms faced extinction if a solution wasn't found. Standard protocol would be evacuation, Vela said immediately. But the population is too large and dispersed for complete extraction within the available time. The Nexian contingent would prioritize preservation of knowledge and cultural artifacts, added a young Nexian student named Lith, but that approach accepts massive loss of life. Mason studied the data, a frown creasing his forehead. There's something we're missing. The gravitational patterns don't match any natural phenomenon I've studied. Lyra moved to his side, her luminescent eyes rapidly scanning the same information. You are correct. These are not random fluctuations. There is a pattern here that suggests artificial origin, they said simultaneously. The realization galvanized the team. If the planetary instability was artificially induced, it could potentially be counteracted. The Denvarians quickly began modeling energy frequencies that could disrupt the anomaly, while the Cronians calculated precise timing sequences for intervention. We need a delivery system, Mason said. Something that can target the gravitational focal points with enough precision to neutralize the artificial frequencies. Vela's scales rippled with excitement. Viridian terraforming technology. We developed it for planetary stabilization during colonial expansion. We could adapt it to generate counterfrequencies. The Solarian biochemical catalysts could enhance the propagation through the planetary core, Lyra added. Our compounds are specifically designed to amplify energy signatures in mineral-dense environments. As they worked to integrate these diverse technologies into a coherent solution, Mason couldn't help but notice how naturally they had fallen into collaborative innovation. Each species' unique knowledge and perspective had become not just relevant but essential to addressing the challenge. When the final sequence concluded, the examination system announced that both groups had achieved technically successful outcomes. The individual examinees had, by and large, opted for evacuation protocols that saved significant portions of the simulated population. The collaborative team, however, had preserved the planet itself, saving not just its inhabitants but their entire civilization and ecosystem. The examination hall erupted in discussion as the results were displayed. Professor Kale called for order, but the excited conversations continued until the High Chancellor rose once more from his seat. Fascinating results, he said, his voice cutting through the commotion. Both approaches demonstrated competence, but they reached dramatically different conclusions. He descended from the gallery again, approaching the center of the hall. The individual examinees performed admirably within the parameters of their understanding. They applied established protocols effectively and achieved what most would consider a successful outcome, the preservation of life, if not its context. The Chancellor turned toward the collaborative team, but this group achieved something more profound. By combining their unique perspectives and abilities, they recognized patterns that would have been invisible to any single species. They questioned assumptions that have guided our scientific community for generations. And in doing so, they preserved not just lives, but an entire world. The hall fell silent as the Chancellor continued. The Andromeda Alliance was founded on the principle that diverse civilizations could achieve more together than apart. Yet over the centuries, we have perhaps forgotten what true diversity means. It is not merely the presence of different species in the same room, each adapting to a dominant culture. It is the active integration of different ways of perceiving, thinking, and being. He gestured toward Mason and Lyra. When this human shared food with a starving Solarian, it was more than a simple act of kindness. It was a recognition that our differences are not weaknesses to be overcome, but essential aspects of who we are. The Solarian did not need to adapt to a diet that was slowly killing her. The system needed to adapt to accommodate her natural physiology. Drex stepped forward, his scales now a subdued green. High Chancellor, with respect, you cannot be suggesting that we abandon centuries of tradition based on a single examination. The Academy's methods have produced generations of Alliance leaders and scientists. Indeed they have, the Chancellor acknowledged. And I do not propose abandoning anything. Rather, I suggest we expand our understanding of excellence. The traditional methods will continue for those who thrive under them. But we must also create space for collaborative approaches that leverage our diverse strengths. He turned to Professor Kale. I am formally recommending that the Academy establish a parallel track for collaborative xenoscience, with appropriately designed curricula and evaluation methods. Both approaches will be considered equally valid paths to graduation. The announcement sent another wave of excited discussion through the hall. Professor Kale looked momentarily overwhelmed, but quickly composed herself. As you wish, High Chancellor. We will begin developing the new track immediately. As the formal proceedings concluded, students gathered in small groups, discussing the implications of what had just occurred. Mason found himself surrounded by members of their collaborative team, all buzzing with excitement. We've made history today, Vela said, her scales shimmering with a joyful iridescence Mason had never seen before. We have altered the future of the Academy, Lyra agreed, her luminescent eyes bright. But more importantly, we have demonstrated a different way of approaching problems, one that values diversity rather than merely tolerating it. Mason smiled, but before he could respond, he noticed Drex approaching their group. The Viridian's body language was hesitant, his scales shifting through uncertain patterns. Human, Drex addressed Mason formally. I wish to speak with you. The group fell silent, watching cautiously as Mason stepped forward to meet the Viridian. What can I do for you, Drex? Mason asked, his tone neutral. Drex's scales rippled with what appeared to be discomfort. I wish to acknowledge that your approach demonstrated merit. While I still believe in the value of our traditions, I recognize that my treatment of the Solarian was inappropriate. Mason glanced at Lyra, who had moved to stand beside him. I think Lyra is the one who deserves that acknowledgement. Drex turned to Lyra, his scales shifting to a formal pattern of respect. Solarian, Lyra, I offer formal apology for my behavior. It was unworthy of an Academy student and a representative of Viridia. Lyra's facial markings glowed softly as she considered his words. Apology accepted, Drex of Viridia. Perhaps there is something to learn from this exchange as well. Perhaps, Drex conceded, then hesitated before adding. The High Chancellor has asked me to join a student advisory committee for the development of the new collaborative track. I believe your perspectives would be valuable if you would be willing to participate. Mason and Lyra exchanged surprised glances. We would be honored, Lyra replied formally. As Drex departed, Mason shook his head in amazement. Well, that was unexpected. Not entirely, Vela said, her scales displaying a pattern of knowing amusement. Drex is many things, but he is not stupid. The winds of change are blowing through the Alliance, and he is intelligent enough to adjust his sails accordingly. Speaking of change, Lyra said, turning to Mason with her luminescent eyes sparkling with excitement. I received a communication from the Solarian Diplomatic Council this morning. They were most interested to hear about our collaborative approach to the examination. They've invited both of us to speak at the next Alliance Summit on interspecies education. Mason's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Both of us. But I'm just a first-year student. I don't have any diplomatic standing. You have something more valuable, came a voice from behind them. They turned to find Professor Kale approaching. You have demonstrated the practical value of human perspective in Alliance affairs. The human talent for adapting to new situations and recognizing patterns across disparate information sources is remarkable. The professor's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a sign of formal respect in Tellurian culture. The Academy will be granting you both special research status to develop your collaborative methodologies further. And I have been authorized to inform you that your nutrition sharing initiative has been adopted as official Academy policy. All species' biological needs will be accommodated from this point forward. As Professor Kale departed, Mason turned to Lyra with a grin. Not bad for a couple of primitive species, huh? Lyra's facial markings glowed with happiness. Indeed. Though I must point out that none of this would have happened if you had not said those simple words that first day. Come eat with me. Mason shrugged. It seemed like the right thing to do. Where I come from, we don't let people go hungry if we can help it. A simple principle, Lyra observed, yet one with profound implications when applied consistently. In the days that followed, the story of the human who shared his food with a starving alien spread throughout the Academy and beyond. It became a symbol of a new approach to interspecies relations, one based not on assimilation to dominant norms, but on mutual accommodation and respect for biological and cultural differences. The collaborative track quickly became popular among students from all species, particularly those from worlds newly admitted to the Alliance. Research teams composed of diverse species began producing insights and innovations that had eluded more homogeneous groups for centuries. 6 months after the historic examination, Mason and Lyra stood on the observation deck of the Academy's highest tower, watching the purple sunset of Nexus Prime. The view of the sprawling campus below showed visible changes. New buildings designed to accommodate the environmental needs of various species, gardens growing foods from 100 worlds, and students of all kinds mingling freely in the common areas. "Sometimes I still can't believe how much has changed," Mason said, leaning on the railing. "All because of a simple lunch." Lyra stood beside him, her blue skin glowing softly in the fading light. "Not just a lunch, Mason. A recognition of fundamental need, and the willingness to address it directly rather than expecting others to suffer for the sake of tradition." She turned to face him, her expression serious. "My people have a saying, the greatest journeys begin with the smallest steps. Your willingness to share your food was such a step, but its ripples have traveled far beyond what either of us could have imagined." Mason smiled, remembering the frightened, starving girl he had first met in the cafeteria. She had transformed into a confident xenoscientist, respected throughout the Academy for her biochemical insights and diplomatic skills. "We make a good team," he said simply. "Indeed we do," Lyra agreed. "And I believe we have much more to accomplish together." As the final light of the purple sun dipped below the horizon, they stood in comfortable silence, two representatives of vastly different worlds who had found common ground in the most basic of human gestures, the sharing of food with someone in need. In the vast cafeteria below, students of every Alliance species shared tables and meals, each accommodated according to their unique biology. Where once there had been rigid separation and mockery of differences, now there was curiosity and mutual respect. It wasn't perfect. Centuries of tradition didn't change overnight, but it was a beginning. And sometimes, a beginning was all that was needed to change the universe. And that was the end of the story. If you listened all the way to here, don't forget to leave feedback about what you thought of the story in the comments, whether positive or negative. Your feedback helps us improve. Also, leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. And I'll leave here on the screen another video that I'm sure you'll like. Big hug, and see you in the next story.